This is the testimony of Dr. Günter Bechly, and he went from being a full-blown atheist to becoming a Christian. It's not a path that very many people seem to follow these days, but this video is a must-see if you want to know how a hardcore scientist would make such a transition. So Dr. Bechly began his professional career as a paleontologist, and he was a very prominent scientist with a specialty in ancient insects preserved in amber. So if you've seen the movie Jurassic Park, you know that that was part of the plot line. In any case, he ended up becoming a fellow at the Discovery Institute in Seattle. This is really an amazing story, and I hope that you enjoy it.
So so I was interested in nature and binge watched on TV all kind of nature documentaries and so on. And so very early I had this desire to study biology, but my parents were not very fond of this idea. They thought that is something that is not really promising a well-paid job. So because of this influence from my parents, I started an education in public administration, which would have taken 4 years, but I stopped this after 2 years because I was totally bored. And to escape this kind of boring future as a clergy, I took a very drastic step. I bought a flight ticket to Paramaribo in Suriname, North and South America, and fulfilled in a way my childhood dreams, because in my childhood, when I thought I will become a scientist, I thought about going into the rainforest and look for rare animals. And that's what I did. I went to Suriname, where there's a lot of pristine rainforest, and there, together with a local business partner, started a safari company called Saramaccan Jungle Safaris, where we organized jungle trips into the rainforest for bird watchers and fishermen and nature lovers and so on. And this went for a couple of times. I totally spent 2 years with some interruptions in Suriname, but then there was a raging civil war going on, and tourism was no longer possible there. So I then returned to Germany and studied biology, started to study biology at University of Hohenheim and University of Tübingen, where I later graduated in biology with a diploma and with a PhD in geosciences, which is paleontology, fossil history. And during all this time, I never thought about religion. It was not on my mind to think about arguments for the existence of God or something. It was not just that I was not interested, but in my late youth, teen years, and also early adulthood, I developed a kind of dislike for religion, a real kind of despise of Christianity. I didn't like it. People like Richard Dawkins or James Randi, skeptics, were kind of my heroes. And I thought religion is something for weak people who are afraid of dying and who believe in medieval or even earlier ancient superstitions and so on. So I didn't think about philosophical arguments, if God could exist, or historical arguments, if the Gospels could be true. I didn't read the Bible and so on. So I was really, if anybody was an atheist, I was really 150% atheist. And even concerning philosophy, I didn't consider philosophy as something interesting. I was interested in natural sciences, and philosophy for me was a kind of mental masturbation that leads to nothing. So even this metaphysics or something was not something I was interested in. And this changed in my late 30s when and not because of religion or philosophy, but because I then developed a kind of popular science level interest in modern physics and was fascinated by these weird conundrums of quantum mechanics and relativity theory and modern cosmology. And then started to really read all these books by Stephen Hawking, Short History of Time, and Richard Feynman, and Michio Kaku, and John Barrow, and David Deutsch, and Brian Greene, and so on. And this started from a kind of viewpoint that I still had, is this viewpoint from a clockwork, deterministic clockwork universe, where I later discovered that this is basically an obsolete worldview of the 19th century. And I discovered this by delving into these issues of modern physics. And I soon discovered that there is something wrong with this materialistic clockwork universe view. And I discovered problems of the philosophy of time with these interpretation of relativity theory, where you have this kind of static block universe. I discovered these strange things that you have in quantum mechanics, this observer effect and indeterministic effects that contradict this clockwork universe. And so I started to explore these issues more, and I soon discovered, okay, materialism doesn't really make sense of all these discoveries of modern science, especially modern physics. And so I started a kind of journey to find a coherent worldview that can explain all these physical and scientific and philosophical issues at the overlap of philosophy and science. And when I started to look more into philosophy, I of course came also into contact with other problems where I never thought about before, the problem of personal identity, what makes you the same you as 5 minutes ago, or the problem of universals, but how can different things be similar? How is this red in a red apple and in a red tomato? How can this property red be at 2 places at the same time? How can you explain this? And this also led to discovering these problems of the philosophy of mind, the hard problem of consciousness, as it is called. How can we explain the origin of subjective consciousness, the taste of a glass of wine, or seeing the color red, or feeling a pain from mere elementary particles bumping together? And this, of course, then also involves question of free will. Does free will exist? And when some scientists say that free will doesn't exist, oh, okay, what implications would this have in terms of moral consequences, moral responsibility? Can we even blame a serial killer if there is no free will and he was just driven by the laws of nature like a stone that is rolling down the hill? So I fell into a kind of abyss of philosophical problems where I tried to make sense of, and then started to explore different views that could explain these different problems or solve these problems. And it started with exploring more these kind of spiritual, esoteric, Eastern inspired philosophies, of this integral philosophy by Ken Wilber, or this kind of Advaita Vedanta, Eastern spirituality, non-dualistic thinking in this overlap of Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and so on. But I soon discovered that this view has inconsistencies and doesn't really make sense. And then I looked into other philosophies, and I explored basically everything from idealism to neo-paganism. And for the longest time, I was very much into Whiteheadian process philosophy, which is a metaphysical system developed by a mathematician in the early 20th century, Alfred North Whitehead. And I became a kind of nerd for this process philosophy and process metaphysics, and had several meters of bookshelf of technical books on this issue, and thought, okay, now I have discovered the worldview that can make sense of everything, of the flow of time and of free will and the problem of consciousness. And explain quantum mechanics and relativity theory, or at least accommodate this without contradictions. But ultimately, I came across, again, inconsistencies that this view, as nice as it is, cannot be true, because it has self-contradictory problems or problems that contradict our scientific knowledge. For example, process metaphysics implies an infinite past, but we know from Big Bang cosmology that the past was not infinite, that the universe, all space and time, began 14 billion years ago, and it's not an infinite series of events back into the past. So I had to give up on this process philosophy thing again, and then I became frustrated. I again thought, well, philosophy is good for nothing. I wasted many years and read thousands of pages of books on these issues, and it all led to nothing. And for a while, I gave it up and did more gardening and practical stuff. But of course, my mind still continued to think about these issues, and I couldn't let go. And ultimately, I thought, well, I have explored everything. Maybe I should look at one system which I always avoided because I thought it's complete nonsense, and that is classical theism. Could this maybe make sense of all these different issues, from philosophy of mind, philosophy of time, free will, moral issues, and physics, and so on. And to my surprise, I discovered that actually the system of classical theism can explain nearly all these issues and problems very well. And it was not what I was looking for, but this exactly gave me some confidence to further explore this route. Because if, let's say, if I would have been brought up as a religious guy and would have looked for evidence that is corroborating this view, then of course there's always the risk that you fool yourself by confirmation bias and try to find just something that confirms the views that you would like to have. But I was not looking for theism at all. That was the last view, literally the last view that I wanted to have. And the fact that still I couldn't deny that the evidence was overwhelming brought me to the point that I said, okay, let's look further. And then I started to explore all these arguments for the existence of God from philosophy, metaphysics, and apologetics. And I started to binge watch YouTube debates by William Lane Craig and others. And there I had another real surprising experience, that I saw that some of these Christian and theistic debaters really outsmarted the atheists and the scientists with whom they debated, which was also quite surprising and gave me more confidence that I'm looking in the right direction. And so the more I explored these different arguments for the existence of God, and since most of you probably are in one way or the other interested in apologetics, you have likely heard most of these arguments. It's basically a cumulative case where you have all these arguments, of course, like the origin of the universe, the Kalam argument, or the fine-tuning that all these physical constants are so narrowly fine-tuned to allow for biological and intelligent life, or some arguments that especially convinced me, the question, how is it possible that mathematics applies so well on the natural, in the natural sciences, something that was called by quantum physicist Eugene Wigner the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences, which can only be reasonably explained by theism. And arguments from rationality, how is it possible that we can reason, that we can think about stuff, because matter is not about anything. Matter is just what it is. A chair is a chair and a stone is a stone, but we think about stuff. We think about other people or about a philosophical problem. And if we would be just matter, then our brain would not be basically different from a stone or from a chair. It would just exist. It could not be about anything. And this shows that there must be something beyond the material realm to our mind. And that was another argument that convinced me. And then, of course, the contingency arguments. Why is there anything rather than nothing? Reasoning towards the necessary being, and so on. So all these arguments together make this cumulative case that ultimately gave me very high confidence that theism is correct. But I was still not religious in any way. That was some kind of generic, more deistic belief that there is a God who is responsible for the regularities of nature, but not really any kind of revealed religious content. But of course, now I had the incentive to at least look into some of the world religions that are theistic. When I believe in God already, maybe one of the religions or some of the religions have more truth than can be found by mere philosophical reasoning. And so I looked into the arguments for the major theistic world religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And of course, I had encountered some of the arguments already while watching these debates by William Lane Craig. And then I started not just watch the popular debates, but also read the technical literature on these questions. And so I came into contact with the arguments for the historicity of the Gospels, the reliability of the Gospels, the historicity of the resurrection. And this really blew me away, because I always thought that Christianity is complete nonsense. And I really hated Christianity. And this was even still the case when I married in 2005, and my wife was from Austria, and she was a Catholic, but not really very religious. She only rarely went to church. And of course, as a good husband, and I was still an atheist, not a materialist anymore, but not yet a theist. But as a good husband, I accompanied her to church, but this didn't convert me at all. And some people, when I tell my story, they initially think, well, probably he was converted by his wife, and she made some kind of subtle pressure to become a Christian. But it was not at all the case. When I went with her to church, I was even more disgusted by Christianity. I didn't like it. I hated that the people were on their knees, and I thought, oh, how disgusting. These are all cowards afraid of dying, and kind of masochistic, thinking they are all sinners and have to beg on their knees to an imaginary sky daddy. So I didn't like it at all. So the same phenomenon happened to me again as when I discovered that theism is very well supported, and I didn't look for it. The same happened with Christianity. When I looked into the arguments, Christianity was the last thing I wanted to be true, but I couldn't deny the power of the arguments. And every time when I had a problem, and of course I had all the problems that are the usual suspects in skeptics. So what about the atrocities in the Old Testament, or did God command genocide, infanticide, and so on? What about contradictions in the Gospels? What about the problem of hell? How do you explain suffering at all? This problem of evil, and so on. But always when I looked into these problems and explored the long history of Western philosophy and theology on these issues, I discovered that they can be reasonably and plausibly be addressed and solved. And the more I looked into this, the problems became less and less, and my confidence that Christianity is true grew over time. And then I reached a point which was very strange, where when I talked to friends, I defended Christianity and told them, oh, did you know that there is good historical evidence for the Gospels, or even for the resurrection? But when I was not talking to others, but was alone in my room, I thought, well, do you really believe this stuff? And of course, I had these kind of epicycles of doubt and belief. But ultimately, as I said, the problems dissolved, and I became more and more confident that Christianity is really true. And it's not because of any kind of spiritual experience. I never had this kind of born again experience. I never had a kind of fuzzy, warm experience of being near to God or having this kind of personal relationship. This never happened to me. My whole story is really very, I wouldn't say cold, but very intellectual, based just on the power of the evidence, of the arguments and the historical evidence. And this convinced me. And then, of course, gradually I had to overcome this long build up feelings against Christianity, and that was not so easy. And the second problem was also, if you have never prayed in 40 years of your life, then it turned out to be very, very hard to really start to pray and develop a prayer life. Because in the beginning I felt in a way a little bit ridiculous, and I thought it's like talking to a wall or something. And I really had to kind of go through months of studying scripture and reading scripture and praying, even though I didn't feel much while doing it, to develop this kind of not only having this kind of intellectual belief that God exists, that you have one more item in the inventory of the universe, or that Christianity is true and that certain events happened actually in the history of mankind. But also to fill this with actually lived religious content, and also to bring this into your daily life. And it had a lot of impact on even minor issues, of course. Before I was a Christian, I didn't tell anybody that I thought about intelligent design. And that is a sideline which I can briefly talk about. In 2009, there was a double anniversary, the 200th birthday of Charles Darwin and the 105th anniversary of the first publication of his famous book, The Origin of Species. And I was still working at the museum, and I was responsible for organizing an exhibition that should celebrate this double anniversary in the so-called Darwin year 2009. And I organized the largest event in Germany for these Darwin year celebrations, which was a big exhibition on Darwin. We built a full-size wooden model of the beagle into the hall of the Chateau Rosenstein, and had a lot of different exhibits on issues of evolutionary theory. And we had also one exhibit that should address modern critics of Darwin. And at this time, I wanted to refute them and to mock them. And I thought about, let's make a large wooden balance. And on one side of the balance, put all the books from creationists and intelligent design proponents, and on the other side of the balance, only 2 books by Charles Darwin, and let the balance go down on the side of Darwin to show these are the heavy arguments and the rest is just lightweighted nonsense. And for this exhibit, I had to buy the books of the intelligent design proponents, and I had them in my office. And while waiting for the exhibition to open, I thought, well, maybe I have a look in the books to be prepared if some of those crazy believers have strange questions during the exhibition. And I was blown away by the fact that I didn't find arguments that I expected by, let's say, this kind of public propaganda against intelligent design. I expected to find religious arguments, and there were no religious arguments at all. It was just based on science and math and so on, and philosophy. And so I started to explore these arguments, and more, the more I explored those arguments, I became convinced that they have merit and that the criticism of Darwin's theory is justified. I didn't doubt the age of the Earth or even common ancestry, but the question is an unguided mechanism sufficient to explain biology, the diversity and complexity of life, or do you need some kind of intelligent input? And I soon became convinced that this is indeed the case, also by a cumulative argument. But this was just an intellectual enterprise. And at this time, I was still into process philosophy. I was not a theist, not at all a Christian, of course. So I had not really an incentive to go public with my change of mind, because I was quite aware this could bring a lot of trouble and could risk my career. But several years later, that was in 2015, during my intellectual path, I indeed had become a theist and a Christian. And suddenly I had an incentive that I thought, well, maybe you should not keep this to yourself as a kind of intellectual, interesting kind of activity, but you should go public and tell everybody that you changed your mind and why you changed your mind. Even though my reasons for embracing intelligent design were not religious, they were purely scientific, based on these scientific arguments. But of course, if you combine these two stories that went parallel, becoming skeptical of neo-Darwinism and embracing intelligent design on the one hand, and on the other hand, giving up on materialism and atheism and becoming a theist and a Christian, then of course it is quite obvious that you no longer ponder possibilities like, could the intelligent designer be aliens, or could we live in the Matrix or something like that? But it's quite obvious that you then rather identify the designer with the God of the Bible. And so I had an incentive to go public with my views, which I did in 2015. And 1 year later, this whole thing escalated at the museum to a point where I had to leave my position. But this just to explain how this relation between my change of view in biology and in concerning evolution aligned with my change of view in terms of religion. So that is about my story. After I resigned my position at the museum, I then became a senior fellow at Discovery Institute, as Julie already mentioned. Discovery Institute is the think tank in Seattle that is spearheading this intelligent design movement, and in a way fighting against this ruling materialist paradigm that science has been hijacked by materialism and atheism, and scientists are no longer free to really follow the evidence wherever it leads, but have to confine their allowed hypothesis only to the realm of naturalistic explanations, even if strong evidence points in another direction. So that's what I'm doing now. So I'm happy now that I can now talk about my views and can actually work in the field. And yeah, that is about my story. What is maybe still interesting to mention is how did my relationship to Christ develop? And this is still something where I think my path is still continuing, and because I still have not this kind of born again feeling or personal relationship. I'm working on this. I prayed a lot for some kind of experience. I don't expect personal miracles or something like that, but it would be nice to have this kind of more emotional side also of religion, but maybe it's my path to have this intellectual approach. So I don't know. I will look how this journey will lead me to. Maybe there will be further surprises ahead. So that's about my story, how I came to faith from a totally atheistic background. And maybe one last point, because we talked about arguments that convinced me. And I had also some public talks where I talked about this cumulative evidence and all these arguments from cosmology and from philosophy. But there's one point where I never talked, at least as far as I remember before, which I want to share today. And that has something to do with a non-rational argument. It's not a logical argument, but it's something that is quite powerful for me. And that is what I would call an argument from limitation. And what I discovered is something that is, in my view, totally overlooked among materialist atheists, but also among Christians that are active in apologetics. And that is the fact that if we take all worldviews that have a kind of circular view of time or an infinite view of time, that this would include naturalism, but it would also include views like Buddhism or Hinduism, which have these kind of world ages, cyclical view of time, where you have infinite cycles of the world. All these different worldviews have one big problem. If we look at our universe and we see it's contingent, it exists, but it could have not existed, or it could have been otherwise. It could have been that Mount Everest is not the biggest mountain, but another mountain is the biggest mountain. Then it is clear that if you have an infinity of time available, or an infinity of universes available, then everything that can happen ultimately will happen. And some people who think about this and who have a materialistic background, they think, oh, that's cool. Everything that can happen will happen. I will be married to Pamela Anderson an infinite number of times. Sounds great. But the problem is it also implies the Holocaust will happen an infinite number of times. And this sounds abstract, and you have to think about what this implies. The children in the gas chamber that watched their parents die and suffocated in the gas, they will suffer an infinite number of times, billions and billions of times. There is an infinite amount of suffering. And the only thing that can save us from this most horrible world imaginable, which would even be more horrible than hell, because also, if naturalism is true, or some view that doesn't subscribe to a kind of soul that gives us identity over time, then we are just patterns of thought and patterns of memories, and these patterns of memories can be repeated, can be re-instantiated. And that would mean also we would suffer an infinite number of times, all possible horrible deaths, burn, drown, and that would mean everybody would be in hell. So the only thing that can save us from this, there are only two possibilities. Either there is a necessary kind of principle that only instantiates worlds that are better to exist than not. That would be a kind of Platonist view that has been suggested by a Canadian philosopher called John Leslie, that there's this kind of the form of the good instantiates only worlds that are better to exist than not, but not all possible hellish worlds. And our world, as cruel as it is, apparently would have to be one that is better to exist than not. But but this view has a lot of problems, because how can some abstract principle instantiate anything? It's like saying the number 2 does something. But the other view, and the only other alternative, is theism, that there is an infinite being, infinite mind, omnipotent, who is endowed with free will and who acts as a principle of limitation that says some worlds, maybe only this world, maybe also some other worlds, but only some worlds are instantiated, are actualized, and all the other horrible worlds that could exist remain in potentiality but are not actualized. And I think that is an argument that influences me a lot, because this gives a totally different view on this issue of salvation, that we are not only saved from our personal sins, and that this is not just an individual issue, but that we are saved from the most horrible possible world that could exist by the existence of God and his decision to actualize this universe and not others, or at least not others that would be horrible in this sense. So that is one argument that you may not hear so often from others that I wanted to share. But with this, I think we have talked enough about my history, and maybe you have some questions. And Julie told me that we can do a Q&A session, so I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Günter. That's an amazing story. I've heard you speak many times. I've never heard most of this. And so that's a really amazing testimony. So just thank you.